Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this meeting entitled Israeli Apartheid, Join the Global Fight Against Racism. My name is Barry. I'm Secretary of Brighton and Hove Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and the meeting tonight is hosted by BHPSC and is supported by Brighton and Hove Trades Council. I should say we're grateful to Labour Left Alliance for allowing us to use their Zoom account this evening, which has enabled us to accommodate many more people than we would otherwise have been able to do. There were two starting points for us for tonight's meeting, which I'll just briefly explain. The first was the publication in January of this year of a landmark report by B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, entitled "This is Apartheid." Many of us campaigning for Palestinian rights have referred to the Israeli regime as apartheid for many years, but this was the first time a mainstream Israeli organization of such stature has called out the regime for what it is and provided such a clear set of arguments and evidence to support their analysis. The other starting point for us was the United Nations International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination on the 21st of March. We wanted to use the opportunity of the UN Day to raise awareness of the B'Tselem report and to place Israeli apartheid in the wider context of history and the global fight against racism. What would the elimination of racial discrimination actually look like? For us, it would mean not only the elimination of structural racism in the UK, which, by the way, really does exist, but it would also mean an end to ethnic cleansing in Palestine and in Kashmir and in Western Sahara and anywhere else it appears. So tonight's meeting really evolved from those two starting points. And for various reasons, it wasn't possible to hold the meeting on the 21st of March, but the purpose and the objectives remain the same. Now, we have a truly illustrious panel of speakers lined up this evening, and I'll be introducing each of them in a moment. But first, I'm sorry to report that Salma Yaqub is unwell this evening and is unable to join us. She was very sorry indeed to miss this event and sends her apologies to everyone. So let's make a start. It's a great pleasure to welcome Ramzy Baroud. Ramzy, as many of you know, is a US Palestinian journalist, media consultant, an author, and an international syndicated columnist. He's been editor of Palestine Chronicle since 1999 and formerly managing editor of the London-based Middle East Eye. So Ramzy, you are most welcome.
Thank you very much, Barry, for this, and to special thanks to the Brighton and Hove Palestine Solidarity Campaign, not just for this event, but for all the very crucial work that you do. And also to all of our friends and comrades, sisters and brothers across the UK and everyone else who is watching us and listening to us at this point. First, I would like to say that it is so important that we try to imagine the debate on racism in Israel. Really, it should never have been a debate to begin with. Prior to the B'Tselem report, prior to the nation-state law of July 2018, prior to all of this, let's just look at the very premise of Zionism, the very idea that Israel was imagined from the late 19th century, even earlier, and all the way until today, as a country that is exclusive to the Jewish people. Now, put historical sensitivities aside, put Zionist manipulation of race and ethnicity and history aside, and just look at the very idea that you go to someone else's land, a land that you say that you belong to at one point thousands of years ago, and you designate yourself from a moral, ethical, spiritual and eventually legal and of course political point of view as the rightful owner of that land. And therefore, anything and everything that stands in the way of this designation would have to be erased. The topography itself, if necessary, would have to be rearranged. If there are people standing there and creating this kind of inconvenient demographic obstacle, they would have to be ethnically cleansed. That really was the idea, and that's precisely what has taken place. I am a refugee. I come from a refugee family that lived in the Gaza Strip, still lives in the Gaza Strip under an Israeli siege at the moment. We come from a village called Beit Daras. Beit Daras is located somewhere to the south of the town of Asdod, near what is now called Ashkelon. My family, my grandparents, and their neighbors and their friends, and about 800,000 other Palestinians were entirely ethnically cleansed from Palestine in 1947-48 to kind of check one of the boxes of making Palestine suitable for Jews and Jews only, coming from all over the world. So that's the very foundation of the racism that exists in Israel. It is so important that we note, and this is a mistake that many people, even within the progressive camp makes, and within Israel itself, of course, they make, despite the fact that they claim to be leftists or progressives and so forth, is that the problem with Israel did not start in 1967 when Israel occupied the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. The problem in Israel did not start with the nation state law that only gave the right to self-determination and national self-determination to Jews only, and making it a unique value to Jews only, and denied Palestinian Arabs, Christians, and Muslims that rights. The problem didn't start with Netanyahu's decision a few months ago to annex a third of the West Bank. The problem started at its foundational level, not even in 1946, 47, 48, when the Nakba, the historic catastrophe of Palestine, have taken place. It started at a discursive, intellectual level, sometime towards the end of the 19th century, where the idea came to these Zionist leaders that in order for Israel to exist as a Jewish state, the people of that land would have to be erased. So we are living in this continuous process of erasure that has been taking place for now well over 100 years. Many generations of Palestinians experienced erasure at one level or another. And of course, ethnic cleansing has happened at not just in 70 plus years ago, but also during the 1967 war, the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and what Ilan Pappé refers to as incremental genocide, which is kind of slow process of genocide and ethnic cleansing that is happening as we speak at the moment. Somewhere in occupied Palestine, there is a family right now that is sitting with a letter that is stamped by the Israeli military in Area C, somewhere in the Nakab Desert, somewhere close to Jerusalem, near the Hebron Hills in southern Hebron, that notifies them that they have this number of days in order for them to evacuate their homes, because these homes are going to be destroyed and demolished and eventually seized by the military and eventually added to Israel's ever-growing share of Palestinian land. So this is really essential, I think, for us to understand that when we talk about racism in Israel, when we talk about apartheid in Israel, we talk about it within the proper time frame. And that time frame extends to over a century. Now, what is really astounding about that Beit Salem report, and they honestly state that in the preamble to their report, where they say, listen, for all of these years, we have been analyzing the Gaza Strip East Jerusalem and the West Bank separate from what is happening in Israel. We did not get too involved in human rights violations, racism, and whatever is happening in what they perceive to be Israel proper. Now, on the other hand, we, on the pro-Palestine campaign, the solidarity campaign, Palestinian intellectuals and activists all over the world, we have been arguing that you can't create separation. The regime of illegal Jewish settlers operating in the West Bank, they are not operating independently from the Israeli army. And the settlers and the army are not operating based on the diktats that is being provided to them by the Israeli military administration within the occupied territories. It is all part and parcel of a larger Israeli military, colonial, apartheid, racist regime that penetrates every aspect and every element of Palestinian society, whether those living in Israel itself, which is about 20%, the Palestinian Arabs, Christians, and Muslims living in Israel itself, about 20% of the overall population, or Palestinians living under siege in Gaza, or the 350,000 Palestinians living in East Jerusalem that now have been annexed by Israel, and they are told, you have a special status, you are not part of the occupied territories anymore, or the Palestinians living in the occupied territories, or Palestinian Bedouins who are living in the Nakab Desert. It is all one and the same struggle. And they are all part of that same racist apartheid mentality that rules Israel. Israel was so very clever at knowing how to divide Palestinians geographically and legally by creating different legal systems for every group of oppressed Palestinians, so that when we try to challenge the Israeli law, we do it also in a fragmented way. So the Bedouins have their own lawyers fighting in the Israeli Supreme Court in order for them to be able to live in their own land without being uprooted, without being dislocated, without their house, like in Al-Araqib village, has been destroyed over 150 times. And Palestinians in Gaza are fighting at the International Court of Justice to end the siege and so forth. So every Palestinian group is now fighting this kind of separate legal battle that seems to be disconnected from the rest of these battles, but it's essentially the same battle. They are all Palestinians living, regardless of whether they are living in the West Bank in area A, B, and C, or in Jerusalem, in occupied East Jerusalem, or anywhere else. And even Palestinians like myself, who are living in the Shatat, in the diaspora, I am part of that fight because I have no right to go back to my homeland. I have no right to reclaim the rights of my ancestors and the rights of my children as a refugee who has been ethnically cleansed from his homeland. It is essentially the same fight. And I urge you, all of you, that when you also think of that fight against racism and apartheid in Palestine and Israel, that you also don't think of it as fragmented pieces. They are all part and parcel of the same fight against injustice that is being orchestrated entirely from Tel Aviv, from the Israeli government itself. It is part of that same fight. And one last thing I would like to add to this is that Barry, I think in the beginning, mentioned Kashmir as well, and I would extend this beyond Kashmir and beyond Palestine into reminding everyone that the fight for justice is a global fight. This is not a cliche, it's not a sentiment, because if you think about it, Israel is part of the same regime, the same systems that control, like for example, in the United States, where you have this anti-immigration policies, you have this racist regime that exists in various parts of the US, especially you see it most notably at the borders and so forth. You will find Israel there. The Israelis and their equipments and their so-called security industry is there. They are building walls, they are building fences. They are part of the European efforts at pushing back political refugee asylums and refugees who are trying to come and seek safety in Europe. Now, this is why this is essential. If you find these kind of same suspects constantly revolving around the same evil deeds wherever these evil deeds are is happening. Israel selling military equipment to South America, and they are selling it to Burma, for example. And the Burmese army is using this against their own people, and so forth and so on. When that is the case, if they are able to find the points of unity amongst themselves as oppressors, as unjust, evil regimes, why can't we as find these points of unity amongst ourselves? So we have to rally around Palestine and Kashmir and the rights of the people in Burma and the Rohingya and so forth as part of the same fight against the same kind of injustices that is also being organized and mobilized by the same usual suspect. Our fight is one and the same as well. We win in Palestine, we win somewhere else. I know that Ronnie Casrills is going to be talking about South Africa here, but I just remember when Nelson Mandela was freed from prison, and when the South African people managed to achieve a moment of victory and triumph against apartheid, I remember how my peers in Gaza all rushed to the streets raising Palestinian flags and the pictures of Nelson Mandela, because we understood that the fight in South Africa is not at an emotional level or an impractical level, but at a real, tangible level, is the same fight for justice in Palestine. And thank you.
Ramzi, thank you so much. You've set us off on a journey tonight, which I can see is going to be mind-blowing. Thank you very much. We appreciate you joining us in the middle of your working day over there in New York. I think you are. So please stay with us as long as you can. I'm sure that some people will want to put questions to you. But I'm going to move directly to our next speaker. I'm very conscious of time this evening. And our next speaker is Rania Muhareb. Rania joins us from Jerusalem in Palestine, where she's a consultant with the Palestinian Palestinian human rights organization Al-Haq. Rania is also currently a PhD scholar at the Irish Centre for Human Rights in Galway. Rania, you are very welcome indeed. Thank you for joining us. Over to you, Rania.
Thanks so much, Barry, and thanks to Ramzi for an excellent first presentation. Also, good evening, everyone, and thanks to the Brighton and Hove Palestine Solidarity Campaign for organizing this discussion, and also for linking it with worldwide global struggles against racism. So in the few minutes that I have, I will discuss the relevance of the apartheid analysis for Palestinians and highlight some of the relevant work that Palestinian civil society organizations have been doing over the years in seeking recognition of Israeli apartheid and effective measures to counter it, including at the UN level. So I'll start with the first point, which is, why is the apartheid analysis relevant in the context at hand? So for decades, as we just heard in the first presentation, Palestinians have been systematically fragmented and denied the exercise of their inalienable rights. At the same time, fragmentation has also defined the manner in which the plight of Palestinians has been addressed to date. Not one UN investigation has considered Israeli policy as it affects the Palestinian people as a whole, and there's only one UN mechanism, the UN Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, which in theory is mandated to address the rights of all Palestinians, but has only nominally sought to do so over the past years. The apartheid framework primarily allows us to consider Israeli oppression of the Palestinian people as a whole, rather than looking at the Palestinian people in separate areas or separate domains to which they have been confined as a result of Israeli policy. And so in doing so, the apartheid analysis allows us to think about an overarching regime of systematic and institutionalized racial oppression that targets Palestinians and that denies them the exercise of their inalienable rights, including to self-determination and return. So this provides an avenue to challenge Israeli fragmentation and the continued oppression of Palestinians, not only in the occupied Palestinian territory, but also, again, as Ramzi mentioned, within the Green Line and in relation to Palestinian refugees and exiles who are denied their right of return. At the same time, it's really important to remember that Palestinian scholars, activists, and practitioners have for decades sought to better understand and better characterize the nature of Israeli policies and practices targeting Palestinians. Together with Palestinian civil society, they've played an important role in framing the discourse around Israeli oppression and highlighted how the apartheid analysis can apply alongside other frameworks, including settler colonialism and occupation, neither of which are exclusive legal frameworks. As such, there's an understanding that when we look at Israeli apartheid, we need to look at the situation not only in anti-racist, but also in anti-colonial terms. In fact, we understand quite well that Israeli apartheid is rooted in and continuously maintained through the ongoing displacement and dispossession of the indigenous Palestinian people. The transfer of Palestinians, which, as we've heard, is ongoing on both sides of the Green Line and goes along with the denial of the right of return of Palestinian refugees since 1948, have been, as we also know, institutionalized in Israeli laws, policies, and practices. And these have been in place since the Nakba, or the catastrophe of 48, meaning long before the adoption of recent legislation, such as the 2018 Jewish nation-state basic law, which, as we know, entrenched Israel's apartheid legislation and recognized Israeli settlement as a national value in the constitutional foundations of the state. And yet none of this is new. Was just a crystallization of a reality that Palestinians had been facing for nearly a century. Another thing that is important to understand when we talk about Israel's institutionalized regime is the role that Zionist parastatal institutions play in this regard. So Zionist institutions such as the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish Agency, and the Jewish National Fund enjoy quasi-governmental status as a result of Israeli legislation from the 1950s onwards, and they're actually chartered to materially discriminate against non-Jewish persons. Essentially, this has meant that over the past decades, these Zionist institutions have prevented the indigenous Palestinian people from accessing or exercising control over their land and other natural resources. And in this context, apartheid allows us to address the root causes of Palestinian oppression and to advocate for needed structural change. I'll turn now to the role that Palestinian civil society organizations have played in advocating for recognition and effective measures to counter Israeli apartheid. So Palestinian rights groups have worked on the question of apartheid for over a decade, from their involvement in 2009 in the Human Sciences Research Council study on Israeli apartheid, which was conducted in South Africa, to the publication of a detailed joint parallel report to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in 2019. The latter involved a submission by 8 Palestinian and regional human rights organizations, which I will put in the chat box in a moment. And in this detailed report, we examined Israel's establishment and continued maintenance of an apartheid regime over the Palestinian people. Following the submission and our engagement with the committee, the third committee recognized for the first time that there are Israeli policies and practices of racial segregation and apartheid, which disproportionately impact Palestinians not only in the occupied Palestinian territory, but on both sides of the Green Line. And since then, we've seen a growing recognition as a result of the campaign led by Al-Haq and the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies in relation to Israeli apartheid. So within the UN system, for example, last June, we heard that 47 UN special rapporteurs considered Israeli annexation plans not as ones that would constitute, but as plans that would crystallize a 21st century apartheid. And in September, we had over 200 civil society organizations that called on the General Assembly to recognize Israeli apartheid over all Palestinians and to reconstitute UN mechanisms on apartheid, including the UN Special Committee and the UN Center Against Apartheid, as avenues to challenge Palestinian oppression. And just in March this year, Namibia became the first country to echo these calls by civil society for the reconstitution of UN anti-apartheid mechanisms in order, as they said, to ensure the implementation of the Apartheid Convention to the Palestinian situation. And in addition, as we know, Other countries, including South Africa, Palestine, and Pakistan, have recognized Israeli apartheid within the UN Human Rights Council, and this recognition is growing since the beginning of the campaign. It's also important to remember that 2020 brought an unprecedented recognition within the UN system of the need to address structural racism around the world. And in this regard, Palestinian and regional rights groups have expressed solidarity at the Human Rights Council level with the Black Lives Matter movement in calling for an end to systemic racism and the ongoing erasure of Black people, Native Americans, and Indigenous peoples worldwide. Our organizations also recognize the interconnectedness of anti-colonial struggles and endorse calls for a UN inquiry into systemic racism with a view to bringing perpetrators to justice. Finally, we also need to understand that Israeli apartheid is embedded in a system of impunity for widespread and systematic violations committed against Palestinians. Apartheid gives rise to individual criminal responsibility, notably at the International Criminal Court, where an investigation into the situation in Palestine has now been launched by the prosecutor. At the same time, the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC has acknowledged since 2017 receipt of allegations of the commission of the crime of apartheid in the Palestinian context. And while we know that the ICC's jurisdiction is limited in the Palestinian case, the court still plays an important role in challenging Israeli impunity, and it can go some way in addressing Israeli fragmentation, including by prosecuting the denial of the right of return of Palestinians as a crime under the Rome Statute. Finally, apartheid also gives rise to third state responsibility, not to aid or assist in the maintenance of the illegal situation and to cooperate to bring that illegal situation to an end. Ultimately, effective coercive measures such as sanctions must accompany any efforts to seek accountability, including at the ICC, and is necessary in order to increase recognition of Israeli apartheid over the Palestinian people as a whole. So I will be happy to send the links of the report that I mentioned and some other relevant material you may find necessary.
Rania, thank you so much for that. We've followed the work of Al-Haq for some time and are great fans of your work, and it's really great to get a first-hand account of an up-to-date account and a good reminder of the ICC's work. So I can see people in the chat are grateful to you as well for the points you've made. So thank you so much, and I'm sure we'll come back to you in a little bit. I'm going to move on. Our next speaker is Ronnie Casrills, who joins us from Johannesburg in South Africa. Ronnie was formerly Intelligence Minister in Nelson Mandela's ANC government. He's a member of the South Africa Communist Party. He's a prominent Palestinian solidarity campaigner and is author of several books. I could go on, but I'll stop there. Ronnie, you are most welcome. Thank you.
Well, Barry, thanks very much for your warm introduction. Just to add that I'm also a very strong and loyal member of the South African BDS National Coalition. I give a lot of my time to that. I've also distanced myself somewhat from the ANC and the SACP, by the way, a little bit of a critical voice, which I think is so necessary these days. But let me say this, first of all, it's delightful to be with everybody. I actually have a special place in my heart for your area, Brighton and Hove, from the grand old days of the anti-apartheid movement, and to stress that Brighton and Hove were always very active in the anti-apartheid movement, as was the rest of Britain and Ireland, very central to the anti-apartheid movement. I also want to salute Tony Greenstein, who is such an active opponent of Zionism, as we are in South Africa, and its conflation in terms of those of us who condemn Israel and its cruel apartheid policies without any reservation. And it's a conflation that they've become adept at, and we've seen the witch hunt that has sliced through Britain's Labour Party, and how people like Tony, Jeremy Corbyn, Ken Loach and others, and David Miller are victims of this awful witch hunt. I want to start off by saying to Ramsey, and perhaps Ramsey, I don't know if you were aware, but for some time getting into this webinar, your name was actually conflated with mine. So it said Ronnie Casrills for me at the other end of this grand presentation, and you were also Ronnie Casrills. But that is an honor. And I think we all know the story of Spartacus and his revolt against the Romans, and how on the battlefield, after the Roman victory and slaughter, they were looking for Spartacus. And they said, "Who is Spartacus?" And one after another of those lying injured said, "I am Spartacus. I am Spartacus. I am Spartacus." Ramsey, what we all say in Palestine solidarity, to Rania, to you, and all our Palestinian comrades, in the spirit of Nelson Mandela, we say we are Palestinians for the same reason that those gladiators lying wounded and dying on the battlefield said, "I am Spartacus." And of course, we all are aware that Nelson Mandela famously said at a banquet in South Africa he hosted for the late Yasser Arafat, "We South Africans cannot feel free until the Palestinians are free." And this is what we commit ourselves to. For the point that you make, it's a global struggle. And it's not just a one-way process. This is a two-way process, which is what solidarity is all about, because we fight a common enemy. And if I might say that in relation to this meeting and the way that the organizers, Barry, have so correctly drawn in Black Lives Matter, the Kashmiri issue, together with Palestine, that why is it that with what has occurred in Kashmir, which is becoming an apartheid and oppressed state, that there's no outcry from the Western powers? They cry out against the issue, on the issue of the Uyghur, of China, of the people of Hong Kong, of Rohingya. You don't hear a word about Kashmir. And why not? The answer explains why the Palestinians are up against the wall even more than we South Africans were. Because Modi, this neo-fascist, has invaded Kashmir. And for the West, Modi is their friend and ally and, in fact, agent. And that's why they're so quiet. And that's why they are not outspoken on Palestine as they should be, and what we've got to pressurize them for. And what we have on our side is the just cause of the Palestinians, their own struggle. They'll never give in with their samud, their resistance, and the methods that it's up to them to use. And on that basis, we provide our international solidarity in terms of BDS. But in keeping with the way, Barry, you link the question of the United Nations following on the Sharpeville massacre of 21st March 1960, declaring that day, 21st of March, as the day of a struggle internationally, global struggle against racism. And you connect that to the B'Tselem report. That's 60 years between the two, and they link. But you know something, that back in 1960, it was actually 61, soon after the Sharpeville massacre, which, as we know, ignited opposition to South African apartheid and the slaughter that took place on that day against peaceful demonstrators, many shot in the back, as we've seen in Palestine so often, to a much greater degree. That a South African said in 1961, Israel is an apartheid state. That wasn't Joe Slovo or Ruth First or Nelson Mandela. It wasn't Mao Zedong or Fidel Castro. It was Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd, the architect of apartheid. He said Israel is an apartheid state. He supported Israel. His governments went on in an unholy alliance with Zionist Israel, which helped them to manufacture an atomic bomb 7 times over, and supported them to the hilt in breaking the arms embargo over so many years. But Israel, at the time of the Sharpeville massacre, had sided somewhat with the outcry, which mainly came from Africa, of course, from India then, not under Modi's rule, from the United Nations, from Britain and France and the Netherlands and so on, not from those governments of the West, from people in America, United States, Canada, and Europe and the UK, the people in the streets. But their governments made, and their press at that time, not as utterly servile as now, came out and condemned South Africa. And what he had to say was, why are you picking on us? Israel's an apartheid state. Israel's chased out the Arabs who were there. He erroneously said, Ramsey, he took it back to the 7th century in terms of what was called AD. Of course, he's ignorant and had no concept of the indigenous people going back millennia. And he said, it's an apartheid state because they've taken the land from the Arabs. So he spotted it actually 60 years ahead of B'Tselem. But we welcome B'Tselem, as we welcome everybody who's prepared to stand up, as you comrades are, against the most awful anti-Semitic, McCarthyist witch hunting that we've ever seen, conflating the critique of apartheid Israel with being anti-Semitic, the critique of Zionism with Judaism and the Jewish religion. Others, and Tony will deal with that. I just want to say in the minute or so I believe I've got left, Barry, in my 10 minutes, that the essential issue is, yes, the education, the awareness, the understanding of Zionism, of Israel, of its apartheid nature, its dispossession, as we've heard so much from Rania and Ramsey, the dispossession of the Palestinian people of land and rights, the cruelty, the criminal cruelty in terms of their measures and brutality, which even the ICC is now questioning, that this education and awareness must be infused. We must get it across as the anti-apartheid movement of yesteryear managed to instill the awareness of the hateful apartheid regime of Pretoria. Secondly, how out of that great anti-apartheid campaign of the past, we were able to do what Ramsey says is the question for us, the challenge. And comrades like yourselves and those all over the world are doing so well. We've scored some great victories recently in South Africa in terms of the courts ruling in three different cases in our favor against the Zionists, by the way. I'm not saying it's that easy in British courts or German or Austrian and French courts. For goodness sake, we know that. But to apply the pressure and the secret, of course, Ramsey, I totally agree, the global linkages, it's a struggle of all of us against a common enemy. And the common enemy is represented in the Middle East in the first place by Zionist Israel, by the criminality of feudal monarchies, or the ultra-right viciousness of the regimes of Egypt and others, the Moroccans as well, but they're all in the lap of the originators of racism internationally in the modern era, and that's the empires of Europe and the United States. And to remind ourselves that that racism infuses and supports the capitalist global system that is the absolute bane of the planet today. And Israel is the gendarme, it's the policeman for the Middle East in terms of the resources which the rapaciousness of those same former colonial powers, now imperialist empire, neo-colonial powers in league with their compradors, be they the Sisis or the monarchs such as in the Emirates or the Saudis or Morocco. And we've got to get that very clear. So to walk and to march in step, to link up our struggles everywhere, to give us the power that Comrade Ramsey refers to, because the imperialists, they are guided by their common rule, their way in which they are maintaining the exploitation of the earth and our people. So yes, we stand totally with the Palestinian comrades and others struggling for freedom against all forms of oppression and exploitation. We've got to link up and we've got to make this something that is even more profound than what we managed with the anti-apartheid movement, tying in with the struggle of the indigenous people for justice and freedom all over the world, from Black Lives Matter, the United States and North America, throughout Europe, to Kashmir, Africa, the Asian areas, Latin America. We are powerful with that kind of solidarity and connection. And on that basis, as South Africa showed, my last point, Barry, is we can win because it's a just cause, but we've got to unite. In unity, we are much stronger than those exploiters and oppressors. Thank you.
Oh, Ronnie. Thank you. Ronnie disclosed to me before we started that he tells me he's an octogenarian. And I'm delighted to see that he hasn't lost any of the fire, any of the inspirational rhetoric that we've known and admired for many years. So Ronnie, thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll come back to you if you can stay with us, please. Now, several speakers have mentioned Kashmir, so it's a logical link to welcome our next speaker, who is Rana Nazir. Rana is chairperson of the Kashmiri Women's Association here in the UK. Rana, I hope you're still with us, and you are very welcome indeed.
Thank you very much, Barry. I'm just so moved by all the esteemed speakers, and I just thank you for organizing this. And you know, it's a very esteemed panel, and thank you so much. I welcome the words of support. They've been very, very inspirational. As you know, the events in Kashmir over the past decades have caused great pain, from stories of humiliation to chilling accounts of torture, Kashmiris, have gone through the grievances and great suffering and the horrors of Kashmir. They're not new. And we can, when you speak of Palestine and all the other, the global under occupation, we totally can, we know exactly what, that experience. And, the horrors, it's not a temporary conflict, it's a genocide. And for Kashmir, it can be traced back to the British Raj from 1933. However, since the explosion of the separatist movement in 1989, over 100,000 or more have been killed in the battle for control of the area. And since 1990, Kashmir has been in the midst of a full-blown crisis. And there's the day, week, month hasn't gone by when we don't hear news of protests against occupation, the voices demanding freedom, and the news of these protests followed by killings. And we share the grief and the sorrow and the sense of loss of every mother, every father, every child in Kashmir. And we're now in 2021 now, and it pains me to say this, but Kashmir has become a forgotten struggle, like many of you mentioned, and I'm deeply saddened by this silence from the international community. And there's no words that can bring solace to the suffering of the Kashmiri people. Feel deeply grieved and feel a duty to stand up and at least try and do what, I can, involving more women and youth, trying to educate and raise awareness. And the issue of Kashmir, it's very grave indeed in nature, and it rigorously needs to be curbed at all levels. Brutal occupation since 1988. The Indian forces have been waging an ethnic cleansing campaign against the Kashmiri people. And the communities, they suffer enormous damage, such as the loss of lives, homes, schools, health facilities, the livelihood, and other infrastructure due to the armed conflict, especially children, who are often forgotten in the conflict, because war and violence not only disrupts social cohesion, but it wrecks the very foundation of communities, and the burden of the work falls mainly on the children, especially, if they've been orphaned, when parents are killed, or fathers and elder brothers, they go missing or are in jails. And in this war-torn Kashmir, described by poets and writers as paradise on earth, is actually hell on earth. And the children are growing up with the violence as part of their daily lives, with no reference of peace. And this affects the lives of so many children and their families in loss of security, income, schooling, displacement, physical and psychological traumas of the violence, the abuse, the neglect. There's fear and torture, which is constant in these innocent minds, and there's no peace of mind. And we know that in this country, in the UK, children who face abuse and neglect, they appear to be associated with increased disorders or anxiety problems like post-traumatic stress disorder or OCD. And the withdrawal symptoms are common among the Kashmiri children, among children as young as 3 years old. And this condition worsens with detrimental effects, having major impact on survival, development, mental health, and overall the well-being of the children. And the adolescents with social, they go through the social disruptions. These Kashmiri children are growing in these harsh environments, feeling this feeling of anger, mistrust, and helplessness and insecurity. They're witnessing kidnaps, rapes, abuse, and the confrontation with the security forces, as most of these schools are actually situated by checkpoints and camps, which creates a threatening atmosphere of crossfires, bombing, and shelling. And this turns them into angry adolescents, being phobic of army personnel. And many of these young children and orphans are forced into becoming the breadwinners due to the loss of their parents and the loss of their fathers or elder brothers. And there's also, malnutrition, as well as depression, anxiety, and stress. It also has an impact on the health and the mental state of the mind. And there's the denial of love and affection. And in and a very unhappy environment where there's no empathy or happiness, only surrounded by the darkness of war and conflict and the intimidating presence of troops with guns. These Kashmiri children are living in fear for their families. And they're worrying as children because they have no life whatsoever. And then there's young girls who are unable to continue with an education due to the negative effects. The girls are discouraged or even forbidden not to enroll in school because parents fear for their daughters, and they do for their sons due to these negative impacts of the war zone conflicts, the fear and the tension. So there's because so many have gone missing. And this ongoing turmoil has taken a paradigm shift when children and adolescents start to express aggression by pelting stones and bearing the risk of getting beaten or injured or even shot. And this is indescribable levels of frustration and anger among the trauma generation who've hardly seen a minute of complete peace or tranquility in their lives, and the loss of childhood when they should have the freedom, have fun, be playing games instead of suffering this stress and loss of real there's a loss of real childhood, which has an impact on their mental health and education. And it's having detrimental effects, if they do manage to reach adult age. And unfortunately, in Kashmir, the children have been deprived of their childhood. They've been robbed of their childhood, their education and their livelihood. And they're more entangled in conflict than they are to their education. And the blame lies largely on the state and the political climate. And this uncertainty affects their personalities. This political socialization over the decades creates fear psychosis, creating uncertainty in the minds. Therefore, the wealth of a nation does not lie in its economic and natural resources, but it lies in the kind of quality of its children and youth. And it is they who will be the creators, the shapers of the nation tomorrow, because the children of today will be the adults of tomorrow, and today's leaders and activists. And the quality and the personality will determine the kind of destiny of the nation. Now, children and youth are the powerhouses with energy, capability, and enthusiasm. But these children and youth are from the valley of doubt and conflict zones, suffering much more than anyone. Kashmiri children and youth, they witness this torture, detentions, and trauma every day, and it has put the next generation of Kashmir at stake, while the children in other parts of the world enjoy the privilege of being children. Kashmiri children, they've been robbed of their childhood, treated like criminals. The ill behavior towards Kashmiri children has ruined them physically, mentally, as well as psychologically, affecting their behavior through no fault of their own. And they are lacking the mental skills that facilitate growth. Children growing up in this chronic violence in their lives, when they reach adulthood will have the perception that violence is acceptable. It's an acceptable means of resolving ethnic, religious, and political differences. And armed conflict in Kashmir has a negative impact on all inhabitants of the valley. The most serious effects are seen on children, filling their tender little hearts with anger and frustration. And the peace situation in Kashmir reflects the tragic fate of children who are lacking the necessary social and mental skills that facilitate growth. For example, I'll give you an example. A toy gun is the favorite toy of the children of the valley. And the sole reason for this unconditional love for a toy gun is the hatred that has been planted deep into their minds, leading to radicalization and resulting, which is why we see the children on the ground, Kashmiri children and the youth, they face the brunt of this ongoing conflict, losing their childhood, their innocence, their hope. Until this turmoil continues, there will be no peaceful resolution of Kashmir, and the issue needs to be settled and resolved for these children that can be taken out of this hellfire. This deadly conflict and ongoing dispute has claimed so many precious innocent lives, inviting human rights violations after more than 6 decades, driving the conventional nuclear arms race between the two countries, India and Pakistan. And, you know, all we can do here is pray with our hearts and souls that this burning issue needs to be seriously resolved to bring peace, to bring hope to the lives of Kashmiri brothers and sisters, all those, and our Palestinian brothers and sisters, and all suffering around the world. And rightly said by a lot of the speakers, it's a global fight, and you know, and it is part of the same system, and you know, these injustices need to be resolved. So I'll stop there. I think I've gone over my time.
Rana, thank you. It's such a useful reminder. Your focus on children, of course, for many of us involved in the Palestinian solidarity campaign, we often learn about the plight of children, especially in Gaza, but not exclusively in Gaza. But almost everything you said could be applied equally to children in Gaza and elsewhere. It's worth reminding, today happens to be Palestinian Children's Day, called by Defence Children International. We might as well say that it's an international day to remember children in these linked up struggles. So Rana, I should have explained that the reason the photo of Rana was static was because she's actually in her car. It's a long story. It was very good of you to join us, Rana, but that's why we weren't able to see you on video. But many thanks for joining us and for your insights into the Kashmiri struggle and its links with others. So thank you very much. I'm going to move on now to Kwaku. Our next speaker is Kwaku Martin Pepper, who is a student here in Brighton, active in Black Lives Matter here in Brighton. I'm sure he'll say more about his background when we hear from him. But Kwaku, you are very welcome indeed.
Hi, I've enjoyed the meeting so far, and I've enjoyed the approaches we've taken from different perspectives, especially considering how multifaceted imperialism is and how it often takes new forms in new circumstances. I want to first address a lot of the work we're doing in Brighton is against the punishment, crime, and prosecution bill that's come out recently against any kind of protest that causes an annoyance or a disturbance. I think it's actually a proper moment to bring up the way we accept discourse, the way we deal with discourse about Israel, about racism, about Palestine, about freedom of speech, and so on. And I think we on the left are the true defenders of freedom of speech. In fact, I think especially this is the true evidence of it. First, I want to address Tony Greenstein wrote an article about his experience at the Sisters Uncut Kill the Bill protest, and he spoke for a short while about silence. And I want to first say that the most important thing now is to focus on the specific parties and organizations that were involved. And the event wasn't a Black Lives Matter event. And I want to specify the difference because we have to, I knew a few people who were at the protest and who organized the protest to kill the bill. And they weren't Black Lives Matter, they were part of Sisters Uncut. And that's a more recent project. The reason I say that is because I want us to have a more, on the left to be more conscious of the way we discuss discourse and the way we go about discussing our views on racism and anti-racism and particular views and so on. But yeah, but I did enjoy the article though. I mean, the particular argument Tony Greenstein made was that the European racism there's a direct link between Zionism and European supremacy and European racism, and that's like the legacy of Western imperialism and colonialism. And I agree with that. And I think that would be the main focus of my approach to this talk. And so I first want to I want to start from like the start of Zionism, and I'll take my main approach would be to discuss the direct lineage of Zionism and its origin within European supremacy, at least its relationship between the two. And first, I'll talk about, of course, Theodore Herzl. I'm sure you all know about the Ugandan scheme when Theodore Herzl got an assurance from Joseph Chamberlain that the Zionist Congress would be offered Uganda. the Uganda would be offered to Jews and in UK at the time to live there, and Israel would have been Uganda. And I can't even imagine the kind of connection, the axis you would have had between Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Zionist Israel. And I think that first I want to touch on that because there's a good quote I read by Theodore Herzl in the first moments, and the first, at least in the first congresses of the Zionist Congress, and he says, if I wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish before I construct. And that's, I think, very important to understand that Zionism is a project of elimination by definition. So there is no liberal Zionism and so on, I think. And there's a good quote by H.R. Brown that there is no such thing as a second-class citizen. You're either free or not free. You're either a slave or a slave owner. And I think basically I want to go back to the current period we're in. And the reason why all these protests have been going on recently is because of the authoritarianism in Western politics as of now, with UK's Spy Cop bill, the prosecution bill, even forcing schools to teach only capitalist history and not anything that's anti-capitalist. I want to touch on American anti-BDS laws that exist, because I mean, Ronnie gave a solidarity, salutes to BDS, and I think we obviously all do. And I think the matter of strategy is also highly important, and tactics from our perspective. I think the matter of discourse is where we need to approach the issue from, because if we can change discourse around anti-racism, that will be the goal of changing Western opinions and creating more public retribution against Zionism, or at least, public decrement and so on. So I want to talk about anti-BDS laws, and 32 states have passed bills and executive orders designed to discourage boycotts of Israel. And they've done this through contract-focused laws that requires government contractors to promise that they're not boycotting Israel. So that's just complete authoritarianism. And also investment-focused laws mandating public investment funds to avoid entities that have boycotted Israel or have any connections to BDS. I think that's something that we have to understand. In a lot of ways, Israel has preceded the Western world in a lot of policies that are very similar, and they parallel each other in terms of authoritarianism and the creeping power of the state and controlling speech and controlling our perspectives and so on. So that is already in America, and you have to consider that before we go into even Israel's historical authoritarianism and historical forms of repression. And so considering that, we also have to consider the similarities from a BLM perspective, things like the carceral system in America and UK and Israel are very similar, and Palestine actually. I know that I've been reading about this, and there's like 99% there's a 99% conviction rate in Israeli courts, in the Israeli military courts in West Bank and Gaza. And there are no like civil courts for Palestinians. The only civil courts are given to settlers. Most Palestinians go through military courts, even kids are put through military courts. And that's a comparison. We can almost see a more vulgar version of what's happening in America in terms of carceral state and the ways to resolve contradictions within the country using the policing methods. But Amnesty International even found that there's been beatings and intense torture methods used against kids, used against protesters, used against civilians, especially focused on even the Ethiopian Jewish populations in Israel. And there's been, Amnesty International has tried to raise a lot of discourse around that. I think that's something that we should discuss if we're talking about anti-racism. And but my main issue to show the parallel between the two is to mainly argue that the left in UK haven't discovered a good discourse on both anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in a way where we can account for a rational position, or at least both a progressive and a rational position. And I think that's where our goal should be in terms of discourse. And especially in the UK, with about 50% Murdoch press and most of the media is already right-wing, we are at a disadvantage. So you have to come with a very, I think, pithy message that we can use to resolve both the tension between them calling us anti-Semites and so on. But my approach mainly would be to discuss ways in which the theories of Zionism have taken place. A good academic activist I follow is called Gershon Schaffer. I've got the pronunciation wrong, I apologize. He talks about the conquest of labor when Israel was first, when the Zionists first landed in Palestine, and when they created, it was called productivization. So I need to get the pronunciation right, productivization. And it's the idea that many Jews felt a self-loathing from being excluded from industries in Europe, so in Eastern Europe and so on. So when they went to Palestine, many of them started segregated Jewish factories. And even with the situation where Palestinians worked for cheaper labor and so on, they created these kind of segregated labor institutions. I think the kibbutz is a very good example of it, because many on the left praise the kibbutz as a form of, you know, localism, you know, anarchist kind of leftist grassroots organizing. And I think in some ways it is. We have to understand that even the left as of now has to pass through the lens of the discourse of racism and anti-racism. So we have to understand that even though we can agree with kibbutz, it has a lot of issues. And even we have to first analyze the origin of the kibbutz system and a lot of things that came about to create the institutions, the early institutions of early Israel. So a good quote by Julius Posner, who was a Zionist architect, one of the big leaders, is a famous folk song. Apparently it says, "We have come to the homeland to build. The creation of the new Jew is also the creator of the new Jew." That's something I think that's really pivotal to understand the ideological components of Zionism. The idea is that it separates Jews, and it's almost a new step in it creates a new discourse where Jews, even leftist Jews, have to pass through very tense, you know, situations of self-consciousness and self-identity and so on. I think that's very important to understand from the left in UK in terms of how we discuss Zionism and anti-Zionism. And I think the best way to understand this to say is as a new form of it's taken anti-racist discourse in a lot of ways and used it to turn on the left. In a lot of ways, like Starmer and many of Starmerites have used many like of the discourse from bell hooks and many intersectional writers to push against many Corbynites. And it's ironic because, of course, we have situations like Diane Abbott, who nothing, like, there's no attention was drawn to her matter. And I don't want to talk too much. I think I've been speaking for quite a while. I'm going to wrap this up a little bit. But the Labour Party didn't focus on situations like Diane Abbott's anti-Black racism. So you have to understand that in UK, our allies are going to be, we're going to be forced to disavow all our leftist allies and even left allies of Palestine and pro-Palestinian allies. And we notice this now with Corbyn, where Corbyn being on the platform with Hamas is seen as a form of his anti-Semitism. I think that's very racist and Orientalist to reduce Jewish Palestinian discourse to say Hamas is a completely non-negotiable sector or group. I think you have to understand that that's the position we should take. That is Orientalist to completely paint Hamas as a completely disavowed and alienated group. And I think that's what we should. That's basically how we should discuss the matter of. It's a matter of allies and a matter of discourse and a matter of definitions and so on. And I think that's the main thing. So yeah, I just want to wrap it up. Thank you for having me, and I enjoyed everyone else's speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwaku. Thank you. A dizzying whistle stop across many issues. So and plenty to think about there. And I'm sure we'll want to talk to you as the discussion progresses, particularly about linkages across different campaigns. So many thanks indeed. I'm going to now move on to our final speaker, Tony Greenstein, who is not only a comrade of ours here in Brighton and Hove Palestine Solidarity Campaign, but a founder member of Brighton and Hove PSC. Tony, as many of you know, is a prodigious blogger where he describes himself as socialist, anti-Zionist, and anti-racist. Tony, welcome to this meeting, and over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Barry. Can everyone hear me? I hope. I'm sorry that this meeting was delayed by a couple of weeks, but unfortunately I was a guest of Her Majesty's as a result of traveling with a group of people from Palestine Action. We were intent on redecorating one of the arms factories of Elbit Systems, which produces drones, which are used in Gaza, Yemen, Kashmir, and many other places. So my apologies. I think one of the most important things which should come out of this meeting is an understanding that racism doesn't simply occur in people's heads. The reason why we have racism in the West is quite simple, because we went to other people's countries, conquered them and, quote, civilized them. And we did that on the basis that we were superior, we were racially superior. And those ideas rebounded back, were reflected back into the home country. And I raise that, the conclusion we draw is, if you are truly an anti-racist in the West today, you must also be an anti-imperialist. The two go hand in hand. You cannot make a separation. And I say that because this meeting, the original idea for this meeting was when it was proposed by Stand Up to Racism, which is in essence a Socialist Workers' Party group at the Trades Council, that they were to hold events commemorate on UN Anti-Racism Day, which was March 21st. And I went to a couple of Stand Up to Racism meetings as a result. And I proposed, in the wake of the declaration by B'Tselem in January of this year, that Israel was an apartheid state. And this was a pivotal declaration because B'Tselem started off as a liberal Zionist group. So it had no axe to grind. I said that it was obvious that if you're going to hold a meeting on UN Anti-Racism Day, which was held originally to commemorate the victims of the Sharpeville massacre, that we now hold a meeting on Israel apartheid. And I was quite amazed that Socialist Workers' Party members looked around for any excuse not to hold a meeting on Israeli apartheid. And the reason came out, one of their members blurted it out, that the issue was too delicate. And what he meant by too delicate is that it would offend certain liberal Zionists in Brighton, certain liberal Zionist members of the Jewish community. And I have to say, this kind of excuse is totally unacceptable. Imagine 30 years ago, there had been 200,000 expatriates, white expatriates from South Africa, who formed a strong political lobby in this country. Would we have found excuses on the basis of identity politics for refusing to oppose apartheid because it offended the feelings of a significant section of the white community? The answer is, I would hope, no, it would not. You have to do what is right, even if you offend certain people, including Jewish people. And that is the same with Palestine today. We must support the struggle of the Palestinians. We must take an explicit anti-Zionist position, precisely because it's the right thing to do, regardless of whether or not it offends certain people who feel put out, complain that they lack safe spaces and all the rest of it. 30 years ago, of course, most people would not have considered Israel an apartheid state. I was brought up, I was the son of a Jewish rabbi, so I was brought up in a Zionist household, and I would never have dreamt that Palestine, Israel was an apartheid state. But I learned better from that. And there are many, many reasons we can see today why it is obvious that Israel is an apartheid state. The most obvious, most recently, is over the COVID vaccination program, whereby Israel inoculates all its Jewish citizens, including Jewish settlers on the West Bank. But the 5 million Palestinians who live on the West Bank and Gaza are simply excluded from that. And that is accepted by the mainstream media, the BBC and so on. That is, I think, a demonstrable example of what apartheid means in practice. But in Britain at the moment, we have a couple of anti-racist organizations, one, Hope Not Hate, which is explicitly pro-Zionist. We have Stand Up to Racism, which refuses to take a position. When you refuse to take a position, you actually take a position in support of the oppressor, because as Eldred Cleaver said, you're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. There is no midway. And Stand Up to Racism in Scotland for 3 years previously has allowed right-wing Zionist groups, the Confederation of Israeli Friends of Israel in Scotland, to march on their annual, their anti-racism day march with the flags of Israel. And I cannot think of anything which is more insulting and offensive to Palestinians than to see the flag of Israel flying. But I think we also must be clear about the anti-Semitism nonsense which was waged against Jeremy Corbyn and so on. Zionism has never opposed anti-Semitism. Zionism has never had any problems with anti-Semitism. And if we look around the world today, who are the most avid supporters of the Israeli state? But people are anti-Semites, from Christians united in support of Israel in the United States, led by a pastor, John Hagee, who's on record as saying that Hitler was an agent sent by God to drive the Jews to Israel, to people like Viktor Orban, Bolsonaro, Duterte in Philippines, who is an open Hitler admirer, Richard Spencer, who declares himself, he's the founder of the alt-right in the United States. He describes himself as a white Zionist. And of course, Donald Trump himself, who says that the Jews are disloyal to what is their real home, which is Israel. I mean, if they are not anti-Semitic tropes, what are they? And we have to be quite clear about Zionism and anti-Semitism. Zionism has never, ever fought anti-Semitism. And I'll give you an example. If I quote from Theodor Herzl, he was the founder of political Zionism. And he wrote a pamphlet in 1895, The Jewish State, which was the precursor of the formation of the Zionist organization. The first meeting was in 1897 of the Zionist Congress. Most people won't be aware of this, but the first Zionist Congress was supposed to be held in Munich, in South Germany, Bavaria. And the reason it wasn't was because the Jews rose up as one and said they did not want it. They accused the authorities of anti-Semitism, because in those times, the attitude of most Jews to Zionism was that it was a form of Jewish anti-Semitism. The anti-Semites told Jews, get out, we don't want you. And the Zionists said, we're only too happy to get out. And Herzl, in 1895, and this was just after the Dreyfus affair had blown up. You remember the Jewish captain was falsely accused of treason by a conglomeration of French monarchists, the army, the church, and so on. And he was exiled to Devil's Island. Herzl said in the middle of this, and it's on page 6 of his diaries, he said, in Paris, I achieved a freer attitude to anti-Semitism, which I now began to understand historically and to pardon. Above all, I recognized the emptiness and the futility of trying to combat anti-Semitism. And that is a point I think we should take away from this meeting, that we will be accused, of course, of anti-Semitism, but in order to accuse us of anti-Semitism, they have to redefine what anti-Semitism is. It's no longer hatred or hostility towards Jewish people, it's hostility to Zionism and the Jewish state project. Well, we should be quite clear. Anti-Semitism is hostility to Jewish people. It's not hostility to a political ideology and movement as Zionism. And a very good example of why Zionism is racist. I mean, I can give us my own example. Me and Ronnie and anyone else who is Jewish has an automatic right to return, although we may never have been there, to Israel and claim citizenship. But Palestinian friends of mine, of course, who were born there, whose families have lived there for generations, have no such right. And so an Israel, a Jewish state in a settler colonial context cannot be anything other than racist. And we have to understand that. Zionism today is, if you like, the cutting edge of imperialism. It's the way that imperialism clothes itself as a morally righteous enterprise. So, for example, in the attacks on Jeremy Corbyn, they could have attacked him because of his position on austerity or on nuclear weapons or whatever. But it made much more sense from their point of view to attack him over anti-Semitism. So we had papers like the Daily Mail, which in the 1930s supported Hitler, which were running with the anti-Semitism canard. And people have to realize that. And the Zionist movement in Britain today is launching a full-scale attack on dissident academics, like, for example, David Miller, but not only David Miller. So we have to be aware of this, and we must refuse to be blackmailed. Historically, when Zionism came about at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the people who opposed it most of all were Jewish people. And there was a very good reason for that. If I quote someone called Lucian Wolfe of the Board of Deputies, Lucian Wolfe, he was secretary of the Conjoint Foreign Committee of the Board of Deputies. He explained how the Zionist idea that Jews did not really belong in their host societies, that they were an alien implant, that their real home was in Palestine. He said, I've spent most of my life in combating these very doctrines when presented to me in the form of anti-Semitism. And I can only regard them as the more dangerous when they come to me in the guise of Zionism. They constitute a capitulation to our enemies. And that in reality is what Zionism is. It is an acceptance of anti-Semitism. And so when you hear the Zionists attacking people for anti-Semitism, we have to be quite clear. They have no interest in fighting genuine anti-Semitism, but they have every interest in smearing and tarnishing supporters of the Palestinians as anti-Semites. If we understand that, we understand everything. But above all, we have to ensure now, today, with the rise of Black Lives Matter and all the other movements, that anti-imperialism is a central component in the fight against racism. You cannot separate the two. And that is really my message to this meeting. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Tony. Many thanks indeed. I'm sure people will want to comment and question and ask questions to you and to all the other speakers. Right, it's first of all, many thanks. We'll thank you all properly in a moment, but we have about half an hour now for questions. My colleagues Ali and Becky have been looking through the chat as we've been going along, and I don't know if either of you have identified, while we're waiting for people to put their hands up, identified questions that have come up in the chat that you'd like to draw our attention to?
There is one on two-state solution versus one-state solution that people might want to respond to. There were a number of different sort of queries and comments on that, and what any one state might be like. Would it be capitalist? And also there was an issue about whether it would keep its nuclear weapons or not. Sorry, I'm trying to sort of merge several comments all in one. I don't know if any of the panel would like to address that. Okay, yes, I did notice some of those, and it is a bit of a, it almost always comes up in these discussions, but I think if we could give it a particular spin tonight, which is through the lens of apartheid.
I think Ramsey has been muted.
Okay. I thought Ramsey had to go, but Ramsey, I'm delighted if you're still with us. Do you want to have a go at that one first?
Right. I'm going to be a bit selfish here, Barry, and just answer that question so I can leave. And really just to say one more time, thank you very much for all these powerful speakers and for the wonderful things that everybody has said and for organizing this really important event. I learned so much myself from all of it. Just a quick note about the one state versus two states. I think maybe it's time for us to move away from actually framing this in the form of debate or a discussion into a reality. There is no discussion because there is no, or rather there's no debate because there is no two-state solutions. I don't think it's ever really been placed on the table. But it was there as a distraction, and it was a successful distraction, and it's still being used as a distraction as well. So the fact that we are, if you are on the side of Israel, then you wouldn't, you don't believe in Palestinian sovereignty. If you are on the side of Palestine, you believe on two-state solutions. But let's try to imagine how this possible two-state solution could fix the problems that has resulted from Israeli apartheid and racism. If you imagine that the problem is indeed that of a particular area within the West Bank, for example, then I would say maybe the two-state solution can resolve that. But how will it resolve the entirety of the problem? How will it address the injustices committed against millions of Palestinians living inside Israel as second-class or third-class citizens, or the problem of Palestinian refugees, well over 5 million of them who are scattered in refugee camps and all across the world, from Syria to Iraq to Egypt to Patagonia, believe it or not. How do you address any of these issues? How do you deal with the fundamental roots of this problem, considering that the two-state solution will not in any way address Israel's so-called right to exist as a Jewish state at the expense of oppressed Palestinians? How can someone be, within the same sentence, be pro-Palestinian and pro-two-state solution at the same time? It's illogical. It makes no sense. Then on the other hand, you already have an active one-state solution that is already happening right now. I mean, Israel is treating all Palestinians as inferior, regardless of whether they are in the galleries or they are in Gaza. They are mistreating Palestinians everywhere within Palestine collectively. They are usurping Palestinian natural resources from within Palestine, all of it. The racist laws that Israel has established applies to all Palestinians everywhere. So from an Israeli mindset, this is all Palestine that is being occupied and oppressed and usurped and so forth. And here yet we are still playing around with the same principles of Henry Kissinger and the nonsense of the 70s, that still there is a possibility that a one demilitarized or a Palestinian state that is demilitarized, disconnected, surrounded by walls and fences, no army, no real political sovereignty, no foreign policy, that somehow exists within the limits of Israeli apartheid. I think having that discussion is, and I'm sorry for using this word, but is a disgrace from an intellectual and political point of view. What we need to be talking about is talking about real equality, real justice for all the people who are living within the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, without forgetting to address the most fundamental issue of all issues, and that is the Palestinian refugees, millions of them still awaiting their right of return.
Can I come in on this?
Before you do, Ronnie, we do want to hear from you. I just know that Ramsey needs to go. So if I could just pause just for a second. Ramsey, thank you so much for joining us. We've benefited enormously from hearing, as we always do, from hearing from you. We know you have one or two other things to do today, so we'll let you go. Many thanks, Ramsey. So Ronnie, yes, I mean the South African example, of course, is pertinent here. A capitalist state that was guilty of apartheid and made some kind of transition, and is a nuclear power. So the parallels are obvious. Your thoughts, please, Ronnie.
Well, I totally agree with Ramsey, and we ought to come to the point of an absolute rejection of the two-state, dead as a dodo solution. But I differ slightly in terms of it's not a distraction. The two-state solution was the alibi, became the alibi for Zionists of all types, from the Labour Party in power, Rabin and the famous handshake with Arafat, the Oslo Accord, right through to the lot of them, whatever party they represented. An alibi was provided, courtesy of Oslo and the compromise that the Palestinian Liberation Organization, certainly led by Arafat, who in many respects was a great, courageous man, but they made an awful mistake. And it was actually Edward Said, one of the few who at the time said, my goodness, we are walking into the trap, and he wasn't listened to. So it's the alibi, and you see them prattling on all the time, from the Zionist state through to the Zionists everywhere and their supporters in the capitals of the world, from the United States to Britain and elsewhere in Germany, that there's a two-state option. And whatever crimes Israel commits, you'll find the Zionists saying, well, the Palestinians are not serious about the two-state solution. It's been on offer, and they just refuse. They miss the opportunity. It's provided them with that escape, that alibi. We had a position, and it wasn't just the ANC, most liberation movements in the glorious 60s and so on, those decades that followed, of not interfering in the internal politics of the brother-sister countries who were struggling, most of them arms in hand. And we left that to the comrades. They needed to sort out the particular outcome and how, what they would put in place. We wouldn't become involved. It's gone beyond that as far as Palestine's concerned, because it's become such a shameless situation. And South Africa, of all places, and I see our dear friend Carl Cloutier, who's one of our labor leaders in this country. I was talking with him the other day. The ANC and Mandela's ANC, we followed on because the PLO said, right, we accept Oslo. The moment they said that, our solidarity for them, and it applied almost everywhere. Sayed was in a minority. It applied, and we weren't able to really provide the full-on solidarity that's required, which can only come in terms of the South African example. We wouldn't accept the fragmentation of the country, the Bantustans and so on. So why on earth support the Bantustanization, which is far worse in relation to what the Zionist entity, its leaders and so on have in mind? The question of what then happens in a unitary state. Yes, it's important to raise that question. But, you know, it's like South Africa. We've taken the wrong fork in the road. We're part of a neoliberal global world, which the Palestine Authority and PLO are part of. And you find this everywhere because of the domination of neoliberal corporate free market capitalism, which reminds us yet again of what Ramsey said. You can become independent, but then you've got to fight for a real outcome which favors your laboring classes, which favors your people, and a real meaningful sovereignty and independence for your country. These days, the only way that can be done is through an international solidarity struggle. It can't happen to countries standing up on their own. This is why we've got to galvanize our forces. Yes, you can be a Cuba managing to survive somehow, but these days, the way through has got to be in that direction. So we're preparing for that now, because there's no way that the Palestinians will live forever under the jackboot of Israel. The Samud will come through, the liberation in certain forms will come through, and the only way that's going to be possible is a unitary, secular, democratic, non-racial, non-sexist state, which we've got to support. And if the progressive forces come to the fore, then there's the possibility that they can go on to respond to the many people who've put in remarks here today. But what will happen? The nuclear weapons, the capitalist profiteering, the 1%, the real rich of Israel with its cohorts in London and Paris and Washington. That's the big fight. But the key thing is to at least move out of the present enslavement to a point where Palestinians are free and can vote in a unitary state.
Can I add a few words to that, Barry?
Go ahead, Tony. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, following on from what Ronnie said, that the two-state so-called solution is an apartheid solution. It's nothing short of that. And the Palestine Liberation Organization made a historical mistake when it adopted, instead of a democratic secular state, which was its original policy, when it moved towards two states, because Zionism was summed up in the slogan at the very beginning of its foundation, which was that Palestine would be a land without a people for a people without a land. In other words, the Palestinians were completely invisible. It wasn't a land, half a land or three-quarters of a land for the Zionists, it was the whole land, and not only the boundaries of Greater Israel today, but it extended from the Litani River in Lebanon to the Euphrates to the Brook of the Nile in Egypt. So there's plenty of room for expansion, but the Oslo Accords were a historical mistake by the Palestinian movement. It was the worst disaster that befell the Palestinians since the Nakba itself, and they are still recovering, because it sows the illusion that it is actually possible for a Palestinian state to coexist with an apartheid, a Jewish supremacist state. And that is absolutely impossible. Israel wants no deal whatsoever with the Palestinians, other than they become the drawers of water and the hewers of wood, as it were, quoting the Bible. So, and I also think that in terms of Palestine's solidarity campaign nationally, it's an absolute disgrace that PSC hasn't adopted a position against two states. I understand why it is, because there are many trade union leaders and Labour Party leaders who think they can support both the Palestinians and the right of the Israeli state to exist. You can't do that. You can't ride two horses at one and the same time. You either have to support the Palestinians and oppose Zionism, or you support Israel with all that that entails. And that's why a two-state solution is actually no solution at all.
Thank you, Tony. I don't want this issue to dominate the whole of our short time for questions and comments. I know we have Marie, you had your hand up a little earlier. Have your points been covered now?
Yes, partially, but not entirely. I would like to continue what Ronnie answered. Ronnie answered what I wanted to say, but I think it needs to be taken just one notch further. So in this world of globalization, I will be just 2 minutes. In this world of globalization, there is it is not Israel and the Palestinians who are confronting each other. It is two world camps. As you can see, we have established that behind Israel, which is used as gendarme, there is Western imperialism. So we have established this, and this is a global issue. And then behind the Palestinians, more and more, there is the whole of humanity which sees that it is not possible to proceed on the basis of such, it is very close to extermination, and it is very close to what is being implied in the deployment of nuclear weapons by the United States mainly and by NATO all around Russia and China. So we cannot separate these things anymore. They are worldwide, and what is happening there in one locality is in fact the confrontation of world forces. And this is why I don't think it is right to think that there is a state possible of amicable relations between the Jewish people and the Arab people in Israel or in Palestine. It won't happen because we are in such an antagonistic situation which has a solution only on a world scale. This is why Ronnie was right when he talked about the internationalization and how we have to look for solutions ourselves. International unification of the anti-Zionist and anti-imperialist forces with the working class and with the trade unions on a world scale. I know this is very schematic, but this is because I only had 2 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Marie. I'm looking for other hands up. I think people's heads are probably spinning. I know mine is.
Kwaku is asking if he can speak.
I'm sorry, Kwaku. Please go ahead. I don't see you on my screen, but please do.
I want to just say a few things. Earlier when we were talking about Ronnie Casrills and Greenstein going back and forth about the two-state solution, the one-state solution. And I want to say that in terms of the one thing I forgot to mention in terms of colonialism and racism is that it almost feels like we almost put new names on things, but the same relations of productions exist and the same ways we relate to each other exist. So for example, it was called administrative detention that was used by Britain against Jews and Palestinians who protested against colonialism. And the same bill was used and stayed in Israeli constitutional law. And they use the same bill that was used by the colonizers and the same name and everything. Nothing was changed. I think it's very similar to even South Africa, where we have the Marikana incident, with the Marikana crisis, when workers were, massacred by the police, by Black police officers. I think that's an important part of it, that Greenstein was talking about in terms of racism. There's often not thoughts in your brain. It's often more relations of production and more of contradictions within society. So the idea of Black police officers, a Black police head, but there was a Black woman who was the head of the police at the time. And even Angela Davis said that the Marikana incident was almost a reenactment of Sharpeville massacre. So I would say that last thing, that it's almost like we can't, even though we have to trust discourse, we can't trust our own discourse, because almost we find new ways to reconstitute the things that already exist, and we reclaim things that already exist in place, if that makes sense. So it's a harder struggle than we expect. But yeah, sorry, I just wanted to say that one last thing in terms of the connection with South Africa and so on. Thank you. Great talk, great meeting.
Kwaku, thank you. That's a really useful reminder, and I think it's a lesson that all of us need to take to heart. Many thanks indeed. Well, look, I think in that case, I will draw the meeting to a close. I want to thank you all. Special thanks go to all our speakers who've generously given us their time and their thoughts on these vital issues. We've had a really good turnout tonight, and thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. We have a bit of a tradition, Brighton and Hove PSC, at the end of our Zoom events, where we ask everyone to unmute and to show our appreciation to all the speakers. So if you could unmute, and let's give our speakers a great round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you all.